Hello everybody, welcome to episode number 4 of Filmmaking with Marcus. And I hope you're doing great. I had a really good week and it's really exciting to be doing this YouTube channel. This has been such a big part of my life for so long that it's just such a beautiful energy in my body when I get to share it here with you. Now, I've gone to school for this. I've written a bunch of movies, over 20 over the years, and I've also made my own feature that got distribution called Unrighteous Men, and I've made maybe 6, 7, 8 shorts or something like that, and quite a few of them are fairly successful. They've gotten more and more successful over the years, even though I believe most of them are pretty strong. When we are looking today, we're going to talk about we're going to keep talking about creating your hero, because I feel like this is a big topic, and also that I want to give you free hands. I want you to feel into when you are writing your movies or when you are getting inspiration for something. I want you to understand that all these thoughts and theories and ideas of how we're doing this, they are just that. They're just theories, they're just thoughts, they're just ideas, right? So I'd like for you to truly tune in, start trusting your intuition, trust your storytelling abilities, so that when you sit down and you start writing, you don't have to be stifled by all these rules it's so often. I was very stifled for quite a long time until I realized that, because here's one of those things, right? We can all look into these beautiful storytelling techniques, right? We look into Save the Cat. We look into the Writer's Journey by Christopher Vogler, based on the Hero's Journey by Joseph Campbell, right? And Joseph Campbell was this amazing mythology professor that was active in the 1900s, but his research is amazing, and his research led to that's what George Lucas used when he wrote Star Wars. He based it on Joseph Campbell's research, and so much storytelling comes out of that research. Now, does that mean that nobody could write stories before Joseph Campbell did his studying? No, it doesn't mean that at all. It means that Joseph Campbell was able to look into what creates a good story, a strong story. And he broke that into a system. And I could go into that actually in a little bit here, called the Hero's Journey. And in the big overview of that, we can say, one way of looking at this is we say we have a village. There's a village in some remote mountain area. And this village is populated by a bunch of people. In this is a very stereotypical, storytelling that I'm about to give you here. So you can exchange all the genders, all the people in the story, you can exchange for anything, for a puppy, for whatever you feel like. The more the vulnerable the character is, the more exposed the character is in the story, the more we're going to feel for them, and the more we're going to be sucked into the story. But for this particular example, I'm going to give you the example of when we start the story of the hero's journey. We look at this little tiny village of, say, 100 people or whatever. And in this village, suddenly people are starting to get sick. And there's this life-threatening disease going on everybody is going to die. And maybe they are starting to die. Maybe people are starting to die. And suddenly they realize that the only treatment for this disease is to go up to the top of a mountain, far away, over a river, through a forest, through a jungle, a bunch of different obstacles. It's almost impossible to get to this flower that you need in order to save the village. But they have the people in town, they say, we need help. We need to send people out to go and get this plant. And they start out by trying to send out some of the warriors, but the warriors are already sick. Everybody's getting too sick too soon. So then they look to the younger generation of people, and they find that this big there's one of the big sports guys, the tough guy. He's like, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna go out and save the town. And he volunteers. And then you have this other kid who's much smaller, much weaker. And so the big guy starts going, I'm gonna go out to the woods. And as he starts going, maybe he runs into problems that he can't overcome. Maybe the tough guy runs into a bear or a tiger and he gets scared. While the smaller guy, he leaves town after saying bye to that pretty girl in town. He leaves town and she stands there swooning over them, swooning over both of them maybe. And the little kid, the smaller guy, he realizes that, oh, but I can outsmart the tiger, or I can overwin the bear by doing this or that. I can climb a tree, I can do whatever, right? So then, but the chase to get this plant is on. But the big guy gets scared, so he stays behind, while the tinier guy has to give it his best, his absolute best, in order to get this flower. So he crawls across he swims across the river, he gets through these tight jungles with all these different forms of threats, and then he comes up and he climbs that mountain. And he climbs and he climbs and he climbs. And as he gets to the top of that mountain, where he finally finds where these flowers are growing, he'll pick them. But even there, at the last minute, there's something guarding these flowers. And he has to overcome this big monster in order to get the reward. So then he gets the reward and he turns back, and now he's going back, right? And even the return is not easy. Even on the way on the return, he's still gonna try to outrun the face, but it's easier than going out there. But it's not as easy as it might seem. So he comes back, and just outside the village, when everything is looking hunky-dory, he looks happy. We are, oh my God, he's gonna be saved. He's saving the village. And everybody's happily expecting this. Just as he's about to come back, the bully guy, the big bully, comes out of the shadows and he stops him. And he wants to take the flowers from the kid. And they end up having basically a David and Goliath fight. And in our story too, David wins. He figures out a way to outwin the big bully, and he runs around him or knocks him out or whatever he does. But he does something. That's up to you to decide. He does something, and then he comes into the village, he manages to save the village, and he gets the girl, and everybody is happy. Right? It was an expensive cost because there were people who died in the village. It was a sad, but it's still, he did manage to save the village. So the stakes were high, but it's still, so if we come back now to what's called the hero's journey. What I just told you was a very kind of stereotypical, ordinary example of the hero's journey. But if you break that down, you look at the hero's journey, they call it, you have an ordinary world, where your regular day-to-day life, it starts in the ordinary world, and then you receive a call. So in this case, the ordinary world is in the town where they are. And then the call for adventure, there's a call for adventure, which comes in as everybody's getting sick and somebody has to go and save us. That's the call to adventure in this case, right? So then the younger kid in the beginning of the movie, we've already seen that he's doubting his abilities. He's already been outmaneuvered by other people, by maybe the bully. And, but as they, so we know that this kid has some weaknesses and that he's got self-doubt. But he also has a strong heart. We shall know that in the beginning as well. But he's in the ordinary world, he receives the call for adventure, and he takes the call and he starts going on this adventure to try and help save the village. And if you look at Indiana Jones, that's most of the time exactly how those movies play out. You look at, many successful movies play out in this similar manner. And it's not that it's, it can be boring if it's way clunky, if you do it clunky, but if you do it in a smooth way, then we won't even notice that we're in the ordinary world and suddenly we're getting the call to the extraordinary world or the adventure, and we go on the adventure. To look at the Matrix movies, and in that movie it's very, especially the first one, it's so obvious, right? Neo lives in his regular day-to-day world, Thomas Anderson, where he's in front of the computer, and suddenly he gets this odd message on the computer, and that leads him, and he says, follow the white rabbit. And when he opens the door, there's a girl with a white rabbit tattoo, and he's like, oh goodness, and he starts to follow the rabbit, and that leads him down the rabbit hole. Just like in the beautiful story of Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll, right? It's very stereotypical as well, the way the story plays out. Ordinary world, call for adventure, going into the underworld, going into the adventure world. You know, in Lewis Carroll's world, or in many of the movies, Neo's world, in many of these movies, the hero of the center of the piece is there to save the world. Whether it be saving the whole world, saving a portion of the world, saving their house, saving the community, saving their own life, whatever it might be, they are on an adventure to save somebody, a kid's life. If you watch The Professional by Luc Besson, Natalie Portman's first movie, it's a beautiful example of that regular world, call for adventure, and he and her, they both get that call, get the call to adventure, and goes out to save the girl. Just like in Gloria, the 1980 John Cassavetes movie, which is a very strong classic movie where the lady lives a regular life and then she sees a boy being in trouble and she goes out to try and save the boy, and her whole life is turned upside down, which is how many movies play out. But that's not a bad thing. I know I used to be a bit of snobby around all that stuff, and I hope maybe you're not, right? Where we're like, oh my God, Hollywood storytelling, they just always do it the same way. It's like, no, they don't. But it's a successful way of telling a story. And it wasn't made in Hollywood. It's a way of telling stories that has worked within humankind since at least the Greeks, most likely earlier, at least 2,000 to 4,000 years. We've been telling stories in similar ways. The old Greek tragedies, the old Greek comedies, they play out in very similar ways. The Odyssey plays out, and the Iliad, they play out by Homer, right? They play out the same way. So this is but it's a very, very structured way of telling a story. The ingredients are different. It has the middle, the beginning, which is that ordinary world, the call for adventure, and we see what the challenges are for your protagonist, your hero, and also you will introduce the other elements of the story. You'll introduce the love interest, you'll introduce the friends of the hero, you'll introduce the antagonist, the mean villain of the story. There's always going to be some form of a villain, whether it be a virus or a real person or some form of weather incident, whatever it might be, there's going to be a threat to the world, an existential threat to the world of the protagonist. And that could be emotional. It doesn't have to be big bang bang shoot 'em out movies. It could be more like many French movies that were more internally oriented, or Ingmar Bergman. If you look at Ingmar Bergman movies, almost all of them are very internally focused. They're focused on the emotional life of the characters. They're focused on telling stories that we can relate to and kind of helping us get through things that are not so easy to get through. So by sharing this, so then we have, that's Act 1 is the call to adventure. Then we have Act 2, which is usually a bigger piece. It's a middle piece of the movie. Sometimes we divide Act 2 into two parts, the first part and the second part of the Act 2, because the middle of the movie is in the middle of Act 2. And because in the 3-act structure, usually we have about 20 to 30 pages being Act 1. We have about 60 pages being Act 2, 50 to 60 depending on the length of the script, and then we have about 20 pages to be Act 3, right? So Act 3 is usually shorter. Act 1 is also shorter than Act 2. Act 2 is the crux of the movie. It's where we have to figure out how does the character overcome the problems that are presented in Act 1. And it's not always easy. But and Act 2, for like many writers, have a very hard time with Act 2. So do not feel alone. If you are having a hard time with Act 2, please do not feel alone. I'll probably try and make a piece, an episode just on Act 2 and the problems that come up. We'll do that. We'll do an episode on each act, Act 1, and we'll do one for Act 2 and one for Act 3. Here's a retake that I needed to do for Act 3. Turns out I missed doing the Act 3. Little ADHD kicking in there, and but that is how it is. So here's a recap of the third act. We have Act 1, beginning and introduction of everybody, all the characters, the good guy, the bad guy, the problem of the story, the friends and the oracle, and the people who show up throughout the story. Then we have Act 2, which is all the problems, all the whole thing. Then we have Act 3. And Act 3 is sort of where we tie all the loose ends together. We're tying the sack, right? We're tying all the threads that have been going through the movie that were introduced in Act 1, and that then in Act 2 were intervening, going like this, and then in Act 3 it all comes together. Now, it is kind of important to know what threads you need to tie up, what loose ends do you need to answer, what questions that were asked in the beginning of the movie what are they that need to be answered at the end. Because you see, not all of the questions from the beginning of the movie has to be answered at the end of it, right? Most of them do. But it is okay to leave certain things open-ended, unanswered, because it leaves either room for a sequel, or you're giving the audience enough leeway, enough freedom to make up their own mind. Now, but it is very important that you feel into, that you discern and determine for yourself what questions those are that can be left unanswered. Because some movies make the mistake of leaving the wrong thing unanswered, and that, in my opinion, is not very good storytelling. So in Act 3, and we also often have the last crescendo in Act 3. So at the end of Act 2, we have the major problem being solved. We have the guy with the going up to the mountains. He finds the flowers and he turns back, and on the way back, the major problem was towards the end of Act 2, where he met the big dragon and all that stuff, right? But then when he's coming back in Act 3, where everything is being tied up, he also does meet the big bully again. Right? And that's the last part of the crescendo. The last part where he has to grow into his fullest potential even further. And this goes true for pretty much all the movies. It's in The Matrix, it's in the Alice in Wonderland, it's in all those movies where at the beginning of Act 3, there's another big crescendo. And then it is smooth sailing from there on out. All right, so that was Act 3. Even so, even with all this structure that I'm talking about and all these characters and these different parts, moving parts in a story, it is more important that you, my dear fellow writer and filmmaker, it's more important that you get really into just telling your story. It's more important than learning the actual details about this, right? Because if you look at strong storytellers, if you look at Charlie Chaplin from the early 1900s, if you look at this Swedish lady named Astrid Lindgren, who wrote Pippi Longstocking and a bunch more amazing stories, that many of them did not make it to America, but Pippi Longstocking did, right? Now, all these writers did not know about what Joseph Campbell came up with to be called The Hero's Journey. They don't know what The Hero with 1,000 Faces were like, which is what Joseph Campbell's studies were called. But what we can recognize is that all these writers had super strong powers in writing way before we came up with our modern theories and structures. The structures were already there. What Joseph Campbell did was only he found them, he discovered them. So as in, like, he saw that, oh, so those are the structures that work in a storytelling. And if you look at the old Greeks, they had Act 1, 2, and 3 already back then. And Act 1, 2, and 3 could be translated into beginning, middle, end. And so I'm saying to you, focus a little bit less on the actual structure, focus more on having a beginning, having a middle, and having an end. That's more important for your storytelling than any of these other ingredients or facets that we're talking about. Oh, speaking of old famous writers, look what I'm wearing. I'm wearing a Macbeth t-shirt, which is William Shakespeare. He wrote a very famous play called Macbeth, and it's a beautiful piece of work. It's not easy to get into Shakespeare, but if you do, you're going to be in for a treat. So it's just hard to understand the language. It's very far from our modern language. So I have been talking about the hero's journey. I've been talking about the call to adventure. I've been talking about how we can translate it into story, where we go from ordinary world to the adventure world to the challenges of the adventure world. And those challenges are often connected to the character's own inner problems as well. And it's not completely unusual that we have a vulnerable main character, strong but still vulnerable. And when those challenges come up in the second act, those are usually there to challenge the character's own inner trauma, inner problems, to help them solve it. And then we move into the crescendo of the play, or the movie, the story, which is towards the end of the second act. At the beginning of the third act is the big crescendo, where there's usually a little up at the end, just before everything is happy. There's another little turnaround, and then we go into happy. Now, we have gone through the hero's journey. We have talked about the 3-act structure. We are going to break down that more in the next episode of all this. I'm encouraging you to go out and make your movie. Make your movie. Yes. All right. Have a beautiful day, everybody. Have a beautiful week, and I'll see you again soon. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and click subscribe, and press that notification button, and I'll see you soon. Keep filming.